to the program. We're coming to you from the Mural Hall of Parliament House this week, and we're joined by the three independent MPs who, a year ago, were thrust into the spotlight when the election result put the balance of power in their hands. Along with the Greens, they backed Labor and Julia Gillard to form government. A year on, are they happy with that decision, or do they have regrets? What are the issues that are weighing on their minds with 2 years left to run in this parliamentary term? Is there any chance they might pull the pin? And what would happen if Labor changed leaders? Welcome to the program, Tony Windsor, Rob Oakeshott and Andrew Wilkie. Thanks for joining us. Let's get straight into these questions. Tony Windsor, first to you. Do you have any regrets about the decision you made a year ago?
No, I don't. And I've been thinking about it a little bit in the last fortnight, that even with the benefit of hindsight, and it's been a fairly rocky road the last 12 months, but even with the benefit of hindsight, I think we made the right decision.
A rockier road than you thought?
Well, I was in a hung parliament once, and it was pretty rocky. The Premier only got halfway through the term and had to leave the building, or left the building. But,
you think Julia Gillard might do any better?
Well, time will tell. Anything can happen in a hung parliament, of course. By their very nature, they're fragile, and that was one of the things we were dealing with right at the start of this process. But I think given some of the significant long-term reforms that are on the agenda now, I'm not unhappy with the decision I made.
We'll get into some of those reforms, but Rob Oakeshott, are you happy with how this first year of the hung parliament has gone?
Yeah, 85 agreements were struck in those 17 days, and most, if not all, are being delivered on. So, yes, there's plenty of noise, and we all read the polls, and it's a roller coaster ride as far as government on a whole range of different fronts. But fundamentally, as far as the decision around supply and confidence, if anything, my resolve's firmed, and some of the decisions which you weren't quite sure about at the time, you had to make a bit of a line ball judgment call on. I think, looking back 12 months now, things such as the call by Tony Abbott for an early election, that's starting to prove up some of the calls that we made 12 months ago as the right calls at the time for a 3-year stable parliament.
And what about you, Andrew Wilkie?
Oh, David, I'm happy. I didn't know what to expect. I'm a first-time parliamentarian, so this first year for me appears to be normal. And it's only looking at the expressions on the faces of the old-timers that I realise it's far from normal. I'd make the same decision again. I'm very pleased that the Parliament has proven to be remarkably stable, remarkably productive. The government, I think is fairly secure in its position. And, although there are some serious disagreements between me and the government, for example, irregular immigration, live animal exports, and perhaps some others, I'll be proud to be part of a parliament if it lasts 3 years and it ends up being as reformist as it promises. For any government to be pushing the sort of legislative agenda as this one is, whether it be a price on carbon, national disability insurance scheme, reform of the aged care sector, poker machine reform, and others, that's a remarkably reformist record. So
the three of you are pretty happy then with the Prime Minister's performance and how this Labor government is going, but none of you can deny voters aren't. They're in all sorts of trouble in the polls, every poll. Why do you think that is, Tony Windsor?
Well, I don't think the government have been terribly good at marketing the good things they've done. I think that particularly in the shorter term, a lot of these issues, whether it be national broadband network or some of the things that Andrew was talking about, or climate policy, or the reform of the Murray-Darling system, they're pretty significant issues, and they don't deliver within months. They'll take a while to get out there before people actually recognise that these are long-term issues that this Parliament's wrestling with. That this government is not a good government at marketing some of the significant successes.
And is that Julia Gillard in particular?
No, I think it's. I think there's a number of things. It probably goes back to do a little bit with Kevin Rudd and the exercise that occurred then. Then the sort of decision-making process of the people. The people obviously couldn't make up their mind between the two combatants, Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott. And I think that's had a bit of a legacy in terms of the way in which the government operates. Well, whether it's legitimacy, I think it's a legitimate parliament. Yeah. It's a minority government. They occur in a lot of places in the world. But I think that's had a bit of an impact on the psychic of some of the players. And And I think there was an expectation that this whole thing would implode within 12 months.
Do you think one of the reasons why the government's had trouble, particularly with the carbon tax, Andrew Wilkie, is because they spent so long this year in those multi-party committee talks, which you weren't part of, but these guys were, went on and on and on?
No, look, I think the people working on that worked as fast as they possibly could. For such a nation-changing reform, I don't know that it could have been done much better. But the carbon tax, though, is central to the PM's problems at the moment. This perception in some quarters that she lied. Now, I don't share that view. I think she made her statement a week before the election in good faith. I think her hand has been forced by this unexpected parliament. She changed her mind. That's my view, and it's a view of some people.
But she hasn't been able to get over this perception.
I think she still struggles with that perception, and I think also another handicap for her is how she came to power. You know, it's not the way we do it in Australia. We don't remove prime ministers in the middle of the night. And I suppose I'll sound a warning again tonight. You know, we don't want that to happen again, and I would be very hard pressed to support a successor if she was removed in a similar fashion.
All right, well, let's talk about that, because there are some in Labor that have wobbly knees at the moment, understandably with the polls, and are talking about what to do, stick with Julia Gillard or try someone else, maybe go back to Kevin Rudd. What would happen if Labor did that, if they changed leaders?
It depends on the circumstances, of course. Is she pushed? Does she resign? Does she genuinely want to resign? Who might replace her, he or she? Who might be the opposition leader at the time? There are numerous variables, but I think at this point in time, I don't expect it to happen, by the way, but at this point in time, I'd have to say I'd be very hard-pressed to support a successor because of the instability that would have been demonstrated. So it wouldn't be out of the question that I would shift my support either to the opposition leader or just to no one in particular.
So if she is forced out in a messy leadership coup, that puts your support of Labor in doubt?
It puts it in doubt. I'd be very hard-pressed to support a successor.
What if it was a smooth transition where she walks away and Kevin Rudd comes back?
That would be easier, but again, it depends on who comes back. If Kevin Rudd comes back or if it's someone else. It depends on who's the opposition leader. It depends on the whole situation at the time.
Rob Oakeshott, is that the same for you?
I mean, we're playing hypotheticals. Yeah. We're knee-deep in a parliament that is working, and it's got a full reform agenda. The Prime Minister, on the handshake I had with her, is delivering on all the agreements reached. My phone hasn't rung from anyone with any interest in any leadership change whatsoever. It is speculation.
So Kevin Rudd hasn't rung you and said, mate, if I was to take the job, would you still stick with us?
Kevin Rudd, no Praetorian Guards, no one. So, this is, from my perspective, as one MP who's knee-deep in parliamentary work, mere speculation. I have no evidence whatsoever other than conversations like this one. So as far as what would happen if something happened, frankly, I don't know.
But that handshake deal you talk about, is that with Julia Gillard or is that with Labor?
Yeah, the paper says Labor, but I didn't think it would actually be an issue. My handshake agreement is with Julia Gillard, and the reason I say that is because both major parties over those 17 days were very clear in leaving the job to one person on each side. Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott were left as chief and sole negotiators on both sides. My handshake was with her. So if something does happen, it obviously has implications, and I think quite rightly, all of us therefore have to weigh up all the options before us.
Just to be clear, you don't want to see her go?
No, not at all. I have a very good relationship with her, and she is delivering as far as I'm concerned.
And Tony Windsor, what's your position on this?
Well, I haven't put a lot of thought into it. It's a hypothetical situation that I don't think will develop. I know the media get excited about polls. I've said to the Prime Minister, and I've said to many people, and I've always had this view, you're elected for this term of Parliament. The polls are about the next one. They could be two years away. So if people get on and do their work, which we're all supposedly elected to do, people will make judgments. The electorate, whether it's our electorates or the judgment on the Prime Minister or Tony Abbott in terms of their performances, they'll make those determinations then. And so they should. I'm quite happy to face the polls at the appropriate time. But I don't get into the hypotheticals. I have great respect for Kevin Rudd. I think I was one of the first ones to send him a handwritten note the morning after the event. I have great respect for the Prime Minister as well. I agree with Rob. I think her negotiating skills during that period were very good. She's been very good to deal with at a personal level. It amazes me that she's been subjected to so many pressures that she never seems rattled. And so she's got some real inner strength there that... or I might go home and kick the cat of a night or something, I don't know.
It might be hypothetical, but there is some low-level talk about Kevin Rudd coming back. The respect that you have for him means that you'd be happy to support him as Prime Minister.
If that happened, I'd deal with it at the time. I'm not going to get into if Kevin did this and so-and-so did something else.
Before we leave the polls, there have been various polls in your own electorates, but none of them what you'd call authoritative opinion polls. Are you worried about how things are travelling for yourselves in your own seats? Tony, first to you.
No, but I've never presumed that the people will vote for me next time. I mean, I've been an independent for 20 years now. And you live in the fast lane, in a sense. You can't hide behind the tree in terms of party policy and say you argued against something in the party room and you were beaten up by whoever, the city-based majority at the time. So I've dealt with that over the years, as Rob has. I'm quite happy. I'm elected to do a job for the people of New England and in this quirky parliament for the people of Australia for this period of time. If I make blunders and don't do the right thing, people can throw me out. I've always said that one of the great things about having an independent is not hard to get rid of.
Rob Oakeshott, do you find people confront you at all in your electorate about the carbon tax, about Labor, about Julia Gillard and say, what are you doing?
Yeah, but both for good and for bad. You know, I think politics is definitely alive and kicking on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and I think democracy is alive and kicking in Australia. Rather than some of the messages we're hearing that democracy is dead because of this parliament, it is absolutely firing, and all ideas are welcome. And I think that's a really healthy reflection of a power-sharing arrangement where people are talking about politics and people are really weighing up ideas. You know, in a lot of majority situations, the frustration normally is that no one's listening. Everyone's listening in this context, and we've all got to make decisions. I think the challenge that we face in this environment is we have nowhere to hide behind a party position. Every single vote we have to go yes or no, and therefore every single vote we are exposed to some group somewhere that's not happy about us, and that's really taking a lot of management skills on all of our behalves. But I actually think that's healthy that you engage on the topics of the day rather than it being disengaged.
How popular do you think you are in your electorate at the moment?
Well, I never think I'm popular. You know, I don't think it's a Miss Universe contest. You know, I think we're elected to do a job, and that can at times deal with issues that are difficult to deal with. But so long as you are going flat stick and so long as you are making the calls within your heart and within your head for the right reasons, for your electorate, for your country, at the end of that journey, you can stand before your electorate, look them in the eye and say, this is what I've achieved, this is what I've been trying to achieve. All 150 of us in that context need to do that and should do that. And the ballot box should reflect a work ethic rather than a political party.
Andrew Wilkie, your electorate is different. It's not a regional-based electorate. How are things for you, given the issues that are dominating the carbon tax and asylum seekers and the unpopularity of this government?
Quite a different situation. I stole a very safe Labor seat, which was sitting on 65% two-party preferred, and I snatched it from a complacent Labor Party. So it was always going to be easier for me to back the ALP to form government. So I think that is one of the reasons I think I'm travelling pretty well. But I've got to say, I don't see myself as a career politician. I'll give it my best shot for 3 years. I'll go to the election and hopefully be re-elected. But if the judgment is I haven't done a good enough job, well, I'll go do something else.
Someone in Labor said to me they reckon you'll get back in on primary votes.
Oh dear, I wouldn't even like to dream about something like that. No, I've got to work hard. I've got to work really, really hard. I actually got elected to this place on one of the lowest primary votes on record. Someone told me it's the second lowest primary vote of anyone ever to be elected to the House of Representatives. I don't know if that's true or not. So I'm working real hard. The most important resource for me is time. I needed time. I've had that first year, which is good. Just as the Prime Minister needs time to implement her initiatives, bed them down, let people live with them.
One of the challenges that you've certainly thrown in her way is the poker machine reform, which she's committed to. But if she doesn't get this mandatory pre-commitment technology in place, or the laws passed by the end of May next year, you've threatened to withdraw support, and you've said you're serious about this. What does that actually mean, withdraw support, though? Would you still support the government on no confidence motions?
David, everyone knows the bottom line. It's been remarked upon to death. I understand why the media are quite interested in it and want to tease it out, but I'm not comfortable...
Government hangs on it. So.
Well, that's right, but I'm not comfortable teasing it out too much because I don't think it's going to happen. From day one, the government has been cooperative and they've shown a lot of goodwill and genuine interest in bringing about these reforms. Sure, it has its origin in a deal, a contract between Julia Gillard and myself, and by the way, in my case, the contract is with her personally, not the ALP. I was very careful about that.
The contract for supporting them in government.
That's right. I had them remove the ALP, or reference to the ALP, from my agreement, because I do see it very much as an agreement with Julia Gillard personally, and hence my position that I would be very hard-pressed to support an ALP successor, and I don't think that'll happen, and they know that, and that's why I don't think it'll happen. I've forgotten where I was going with
the deal on the poker machines and withdrawing support.
Look, I don't think it'll happen. It has its origins with that agreement, but I feel that the Prime Minister and Jenny Macklin, the relevant minister, they're doing more than just honouring a deal with me. They didn't want to go there. They've been pushed there, but they're there now.
Well, it's causing Labor a fair bit of grief, but it's not just getting Labor over the line. These guys have to support it as well because the coalition's voting against it. So where do you two stand on the mandatory pre-commitment technology that Andrew Wilkie is pushing?
Well, and Andrew's aware of this. It's highly unlikely I'd support it. I don't think it would hit the target audience, and I think there's a number of things that happen in terms of collateral damage. But I've got to say that some of the strategists in the club movement need their heads read. If they think what they're doing and subjecting Andrew and other members of Parliament to this sort of nonsense that's going on out there in clubland, they really haven't seen many political strategies work.
But you're not disposed to support it at the moment. You've made that.
I think it'd be highly unlikely I'd support it.
And Rob Oakeshott?
Yeah, I want to see the legislation. I think cliched, but devil's in the detail on this one. So really waiting for the legislation, and in that time talking to clubs locally, talking to the churches and the social justice movement locally, and continuing to talk to Andrew, who sits next to me in the Parliament, about it all. And I've got to back up what Tony says. Whilst it's certainly going to weigh it up on its merits, the club movement, I mean, taking defamation action against Andrew at the moment is ridiculous and does not help their cause at all. And, from this perspective, doing that to any MP, let alone to, the person I sit next to, does not assist in my judgment on what is a highly controversial issue.
Sure, but the clubs in seats like yours play a bigger community role than perhaps they do in many other metropolitan seats, don't they? So it's a sensitive issue for you.
Well, it is, but to me it's fairly clear-cut as well. Given the forms of gambling that are out there now, I don't see what Andrew was originally talking about, and it could change over time in terms of what the legislation, the point Rob makes is very valid. We're going to see what we eventually end up looking at in terms of potentially voting for. But I can't see a scenario that actually addresses the issue through this proposal that Andrew is talking about.
So, and this is the problem, isn't it? So you might get Labor on board, but if you don't have Tony Windsor or Rob Oakeshott, the thing's not going to get through. What happens then? You pull the pin on Labor's government.
Well, it's not necessarily the case that it hinges on Tony's and Rob's support. It's certainly a whole lot easier, and I'll keep working on these two characters until May next year. But there are other scenarios.
Some in the coalition
Well,
supporting?
there are 6 crossbenchers. The government needs a support of 4. And I think I can speak for Tony and Rob and my other colleagues in saying that we all agree and share a view that there does need to be poker machine reform, that they are causing enormous damage in the community and we need to do something about it. If there's a disagreement at the moment, it's over exactly what we do. So I think I'm starting from a pretty strong position. There's the other issue about, coalition members. If you've been touched by this, not perhaps as a problem gambler themselves, but if their mum or their dad or their son or daughter, brother, sister, someone who works for them, if they've been affected by it, and that Member of Parliament's been touched by it, it can bring up very strong emotions, very strong feelings. And I think that, in fact, I'm sure that between the 6 crossbenchers and the opposition, I think the numbers are there, so I think it will pass. You desperately want me to say this, so I will say it. If it doesn't pass both Houses of Parliament by the budget early next May, I will tear up my agreement, and we will then be in uncharted waters.
But you're not going to back Tony Abbott, are you?
I don't know what I'll do. We'll be in uncharted waters. I could back no one, or I could back Tony Abbott. There'd be a ball in Tony Abbott's court at that stage. I actually think, in fact, I know Tony Abbott also agrees that we need to have reform of poker machine legislation. He doesn't seem to show he doesn't show any interest in mandatory pre-commitment. He has expressed an interest to me in the idea of pre-commitment. You know, he needs to be very careful here the way he handles this, because there's been a succession of polls now over a number of months consistently showing overwhelming public support for these poker machine reforms. So it's a political minefield for Tony Abbott.
Mandatory pre-commitment, just for pre-commitment.
Just in the last week, a poll by Essential. A few weeks ago, a poll by the Australian National University.
The Essential poll didn't say mandatory pre-commitment. I mean, you can have pre-commitment technology voluntarily, but you're after mandatory pre-commitment.
No, the question in the Essential poll did refer to people having to set a limit. It didn't use the term mandatory pre-commitment, nor did the ANU poll use the term pre-commitment, but they both asked very specific questions about people having to set a limit. And when confronted with that question, a clear majority of the Australian population favours these reforms.
But not Tony Abbott, so what's the point of even flirting with the idea of backing him?
Well, if it got to that, it wouldn't be in the expectation that he would be any better. It would just be me being a man of my word. Look, there's no way to dress this up and make it look pretty, but the fact is this is an historic reform. It is as hard a challenge that you could throw at any government that we've ever had in this country. No wonder no federal government has gone near it with a barge pole. Frankly, the only way to make this happen is to make the government's very existence dependent on it. And then at the end of the day, I've got to be a man of my word and I'll do what I say.
Well, you're certainly putting them on the spot, that's for sure. There are plenty of other reforms, of course, that are dominating this parliament. Carbon tax is one of them. And after the break, we're going to look at why the three of you are so committed to this carbon tax. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're joined this week by the three independents who are supporting this Gillard government in the lower house: Tony Windsor, Rob Oakeshott and Andrew Wilkie. Rob Oakeshott, one of the things you pushed for in those 17 days when you were all deciding who to back in government, one of the things you pushed for particularly was a change to the way Parliament works. We were told about a new paradigm, about a kinder and gentler polity.
Bob Cattersworth.
Well, interesting that you blame him for that. Has it not happened?
Look, the majority of it, there has been some real culture change and some substantial change in the way Parliament works.
You think culture change?
Look, there has been for a lot of it. Obviously, where I'm going, and I think where you're probing, is question time. That's still a mess, and even this week they were still sorting out the cultural issues there. And I think there are still need for some procedural changes in that context. But for the Liberal Party, National Party, Greens, crossbenchers and Labor Party to reach an agreement on the 16th day after the election, and for the vast majority of that to be upheld, I think is hats off to this building. It is a pretty substantial period where the committee structure now is much more active and has much more status. Private members' business is double, and we're seeing private members' bills get through the Parliament. Andrew's got one through, the 18th. I got one through today, the 19th, in the history of Australian politics. Tony's introduced one this week, hopefully the 20th. You know, there are real opportunities for all local members to do local members' work.
It is question time.
Good.
It's question time. A lot of people, obviously, is their only window into Parliament as they watch it in the afternoon or on the television news that night. It is, as you say, still a mess. Is there anything that can be done to fix that, or are we stuck with this, fairly nasty behaviour?
Look, I think the last 48 hours is a pretty critical moment where the agreements reached allowed the Speaker, gave the Speaker independence. You didn't need a Member of Parliament to stand up to take a point of order to get the Speaker to rule on it. The independent Speaker can now rule on issues at their discretion. It's taken a while, I think, for Harry Jenkins to really muscle up on that. But what we've seen in the last 48 hours is him bite the bullet, and we're starting to now see a real tension as to, is this cultural change going to happen in question time or not? The last 2 days have been pretty messy as it sorts itself out, but hopefully Harry holds the line and the Speaker's authority from the chair is upheld. And if that happens, I think we will start to see question time clean itself up a bit.
This is your first time in Parliament, Andrew Wilkie. I mean, you would have watched question time in Parliament, I'm sure, but being there on the floor, how do you find it, watching this extraordinary behaviour?
It makes me wonder what it used to be like if this is any better. I'm often disappointed. You know, as someone who until a year ago was, you know, an outsider looking in and critical of the goings on, you know, I would have hoped that the members in this place in the Parliament would just sometimes grow up, that they'd realise that they've got the whole country looking at them, becoming very cynical about the way our Parliament works. You know, every now and then you get a good question, a great answer, and you think, wow, that's how it should work all the time.
They're pretty rare, though, aren't they? I mean, the Dorothy Dixes on the government side, the opposition asking questions that are simply designed to, you know, get up a line of attack. 90% of question times, pretty meaningless.
Yeah, and you know what? Most of that 10% are the questions that come from the crossbenchers.
Thought you might say that.
Well, but I think that's the case. I think because we tend to strip the politics out of our questions and just ask a question. Ask a question in the public interest, whether it be something for our electorate or something more broad.
It's actually a fair point. I mean, why can't backbenchers in the major parties ask real questions?
Well,
they're probably not the one to ask.
They're not given the freedom. I can remember in the New South Wales Parliament, back in another hung parliament, where the opposition walked out, thinking question time would end. And I think there were 4 independents in that particular parliament. We assumed the front bench and asked real questions and actually got real answers. Yeah. It is a shame because, and I don't exonerate the media from question time either, because it's the window to the media and the combative nature of our system, where the 2 major parties, you know, they see it as a daily contest. They score it at the end of the day, and the media feeds off it. Regrettably, we get this sort of stunts and slogans and one-liners, so anything of any real depth or policy nature just doesn't get into question time. But that's not to say the Parliament isn't working you know, in the other time of the parliamentary procedures. And I think the other thing in this particular parliament that I've noticed is that there is a real agenda on the opposition leaders' side to actually make this parliament look like a mess, to add to this argument that the parliament's not working, we need another poll, it's all just degenerated into this and that. Well, he's been a prime mover in actually driving that agenda.
Well, the main thing that he has been attacking, and perhaps the reason why the temperature's raised so much in the last 48 hours, is the carbon tax. The bills are now in the House, they're being debated, have been debated this week, and that'll continue for the coming weeks. The 3 of you are all supporters of the carbon tax, but what do you make of these arguments that we're going to have a carbon price starting at $23 a tonne? That's more than any other carbon price around the world, I think. It is going to mean that some heavy industry are comparatively disadvantaged to their international competitors, and it's not necessarily going to reduce Australia's emissions overall. So how do you sell this to your own electorates, Rob?
Well, you don't buy and sell a tax. So for all of us, I hope we will get through this period of calling it a tax. We are establishing a trading scheme and putting and essentially developing carbon permits to work within a scheme. And from my perspective, in the decision I've made, I've walked through the gates of common sense and logic. The question of the science, which most members of Parliament are now locked in on, is one that you rely on the expert advice available, and the Chief Scientist of Australia is telling this place the science question is real and needs to be dealt with. Then you move to the economics, and you get the very best economic advice you can find, and the vast majority of even the most conservative economists are saying a market-based response, an emissions trading scheme, is the way to go. So
where does industry fit into that? And they're saying, hang on, wait until the rest of the world does a bit more before we disadvantage ourselves.
Where industry fits in is the great story of Australian business history. We either clean our act up, we innovate, or we buy our way out of trouble. And they're the three options for business in Australia. And I have full confidence that the Australian business community, A, gets that, and B, would much prefer the lowest cost, lowest risk option from this place rather than the alternative in response to the science, which is a significantly higher cost and a significantly lower risk, higher risk in dealing with, whether we actually do or don't start to respond to that question of 5% emissions by 2020.
Andrew Wilkie, you've, in your electorate, got some heavy industry there, the zinc works. You did negotiate some assistance for them. But even despite that assistance, isn't the whole point of this carbon tax emissions trading scheme to shift away from high-polluting manufacturing like zinc into cleaner technologies?
Well, I think I've got more credit than I deserve as far as the zinc works, but I'm very pleased with that outcome for them. I am one of, I think, 3 members of the House of Representatives who went to the last election campaigning on the need to put a price on carbon. I think Rob was one, and Adam Baird from the Greens was the third. I don't know if there are any more. 4. There we go. There's 4 of us. So for me to turn around and to support this was quite easy. I'm just doing what I said I would do. And I think it's actually quite easy to make the case that we need to clean up the environment, we need to prepare the Australian economy for the global future economy, and a good way to do that is to, for now, build a mechanism, get used to the mechanism with the settings turned right down low so they don't have nearly as much effect as we might need to have, and then as our major trading partners come on board, we just turn the settings up. So I think the government has actually done a good job on this. I think my colleagues who have been on the committee have done a good job to build, I think, an effective mechanism, but have the sense to keep the settings down low for now.
But getting back to the question, it's about a readjustment, a fundamental shift in our economy. There are going to be job losses along the way. That's the whole point of this.
Yes, there will be. There will be some job losses, and yes, the economy will need to adjust. And it won't be without some pain for some individuals. But what's the alternative? I've got a 4.5-year-old daughter, I've got a 3-year-old daughter, and I'm determined to leave this world a better and a cleaner and Australia a more prosperous place than when I found it.
And I've got to say, it is not inconsistent to say you stand up for jobs and you want to put a price on carbon. The undisputed independent Treasury advice in this is saying 1.6 million jobs growth by 2020. The Australian story right now, we undersell it. We live in a good place at a good time, and the times are right for a reform such as this.
Would it help, though, Tony Windsor, if we did see greater steps from China, from India, from some of our competitors on this climate change issue?
Well, I just spent some time overseas, particularly in Europe, and I was the one that made a demand of Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott that the Productivity Commission, the Greens get blamed for everything. I was the one that put that condition on the formation of government, that the Productivity Commission go out and look at what the rest of the world's doing, that Ross Garnaut revisit the economics and the science, and that the Climate Commission be actually set up. But when you look at carbon abatement globally, there's an enormous amount being done. I know we can trivialise the debate and bring it back to how many carbon taxes there are or emissions trading schemes, and there's probably about 40. But we're going to have about 6 in China within the year. There's a lot of work being done. There are a lot of other policies, and it gets to the point of the $23. There are a lot of other policies that are a lot more expensive in terms of the abatement of 1 tonne. And it goes back to Rob's point. The cheapest way of doing this isn't through cash for clunkers, which was equivalent to about a carbon price of about $400 a tonne to get that carbon abatement. It is through a market-based mechanism. Now, the tax issue is the politics. That's the politics in this building at the moment. I would have preferred to have gone with a shorter fixed price period, which is the tax, into the ETS. But this is about an internationally linked emissions trading scheme, and there will be linkages internationally. I think the job thing, that's today's debate. Regional Australia stands to benefit more than any other area in Australia from renewable energy. It's just extraordinary that regional members of Parliament can actually stand up in here and run all these negatives all of the time and not even bother to look at the positives.
Yeah, David, right here last night, this area was full with a Clean Energy Council function. They are ready to rip. They are sitting on money, wanting to invest as soon as this legislation gets through. This is going to be a good news story for Australia, for the economy and for jobs.
So much so, in fact, that Australia could be to renewable energy in the future what Saudi Arabia is to oil now. You know, we just need to get on board and invest in it and make it happen. And full marks for this government for doing that.
It's just being lost on the electorate, though, isn't it? I mean,
for the moment it is. Because a few years ago, the issue was climate change, global responsibility, what are we going to do? And to his credit, Malcolm Turnbull and Ian Macfarlane and Penny Wong, actually, this is a long-term issue, not good for short-term parliaments and politics. How are we going to address this? They actually sat down and tried to address it. That all fell apart when Turnbull lost leadership. Abbott came in, saw the short-term advantage, ran the race. But the long-term issue...
Well. In the middle of that, Copenhagen fell over in the world. US and China couldn't reach agreement, and the US has now shelved its national trading plan.
Because we've all gone checking ourselves, and I went to New Zealand, the lived experience. They've got an emissions trading scheme brought in under a Conservative government. Talking directly to the Minister for Climate Change there, he said because they basically ripped off our CPRS and got it through their parliament, he is now playing one of the key negotiating roles between China and the US in reaching this global agreement. It's on. It's a question of when. It's sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. There is going to be the global handshake.
Global agreement in the next 5 to 10 years.
In my view, yeah. And to hear from them, New Zealand, we get accused of only putting out 0.0000 whatever, but there is a geopolitical issue going on here as well. New Zealand puts out less than we do. Because they did what we should have done, arguably they're now taking the place, in a diplomatic sense, the role that we should have. And that is cutting the international deal on this, which is significant. And it's disappointing because New Zealand can protect their sovereign interests by doing that, and we can't.
There's a lot more I want to talk about. We're going to have to take another break. Another regional issue, coal seam gas in particular. It's creating a lot of angst in regional areas. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're joined this week by the 3 independent MPs in the lower house who are supporting the Gillard government. Tony Windsor, Rob Oakeshott and Andrew Wilkie. I want to turn to the issue of coal seam gas mining. It's a red-hot issue in regional areas in particular. There's a lot of alarm growing as this coal seam gas expands rapidly. Tony Windsor, you've introduced a bill which would give the Commonwealth greater power to intervene and stop mining projects going ahead if there is a concern about the impact on water supplies. How would that work?
Well, it creates another trigger for an existing piece of legislation, the Environmental Protection and Conservation Act. I've missed a word there, but currently there's about 3 triggers to that. Threatened species, heritage and some international treaties.
This is another one.
This would introduce another one. It doesn't invade every mine site. It would only involve the Commonwealth, as that Conservation Act does now, when the trigger is pulled. And where there were real concerns about groundwater or the interrelationship between groundwater and surface water in coal seam gas or other extractive activities, the Commonwealth could come in, as it does now, and impose some conditions, 300 conditions on the latest gas field in Queensland, or in those high-risk areas, it could actually prevent an activity from proceeding.
How worried are you about coal seam gas mining? Has it gone too far?
In certain areas, I think it's an activity that shouldn't occur. And I think we've got to get the science, we've got to breathe in on this, get the process right, get the science right, and then make some decisions based on risk. You can never not have any risk, but there are some very productive areas of Australia, particularly with groundwater and surface water issues, that if coal seam gas and some coal mining activities were allowed to occur, they could have everlasting detrimental impacts on the hydraulic systems in the Murray-Darling system in particular.
And it's also a question about losing food-producing areas to mining, isn't it?
Potentially. And there again is another risk, because a lot of these areas where they're looking for coal seam gas, they're looking for coal, are floodplains. And we're going through all this process at the moment of trying to resolve the Murray-Darling issue and have a solution that's based on the states and the Commonwealth playing a role, but we allow the states to control the development processes in terms of the extractive industries, which could have a major impact on groundwater, surface water, Great Artesian Basin in some areas. It just seems farcical that we could design a scheme that puts budgets on water and then allows an activity to occur that could just ruin parts of that system.
As has often been pointed out, though, when it comes to this issue of food security and making sure we have enough prime agricultural land, you yourself sold some farming land to a coal mining outfit for several $1 million. I mean, does that... It wasn't coal seam gas mining, so it's not about the same issues on the water supply, but does that go to the question of whether we're giving away too much farmland to mining?
Well, to answer the specific allegation that I sold some farming land to a coal mine, a coal mine is next door to my property. Some of that land was a gravel ridge that had been supplying gravel for about 50 years. Some of that land was an existing coal mine that had been operating for about 80 years. The coal mine that we were talking about will impact on about 25 acres, the gravel ridge, because the coal's under it. It's not on a floodplain, it's not in a groundwater area. It's the sort of land that should be mined, actually. I'd argue that that sort of land is where the miners should be going, rather than out onto the floodplain where you have these delicate relationships between water, groundwater and surface water.
Rob Oakeshott, how concerned are you about coal seam gas mining, and what about this idea that was floated briefly by Tony Abbott of allowing farmers to say no and shut the gate to coal seam gas miners?
Well, to end the first question first, very concerned. In the southern part of the electorate of Lyne, the very beautiful Gloucester Basin is now right on getting the top end of that Upper Hunter expansion, and there's exploration licences that, if they're fulfilled over the next decade, Gloucester will completely look different. It'll be a moonscape. Likewise, there's investigations going in through the Manning Valley, through the Camden Haven, so really getting close to the eastern seaboard and also some pretty high population areas. So there is a lot of concern within the community about this. Everyone's concerned about the very obvious no-brainers of clean water and this emerging concept amongst soil scientists of peak soils, the increasing loss and speed of productive lands around the world when we're supposed to have 9 billion people to feed by 2050.
Is the government doing enough about all this?
Well, not at this stage. They very quietly released a food policy last week, and I think this is an issue that really does need to be elevated, because agriculture, should have a place in Australia because of the amount of land we've got, but for economic reasons, if the 9 billion people by 2050 is true, that is going to be the boom industry for a country as large as Australia with so much available land. So we've got the short-term issue of feeding the beast of energy security today and keeping our energy afloat. We've got to get this balance right, though, of making sure we don't kill the economy of the future, which ironically is agriculture is going to play a very big part of.
I want to shift to the issue of asylum seekers, because this week in particular the government's been battling to win support for its changes to the Migration Act, which it wants to revive its Malaysia people swap agreement. Tony Abbott's not ruling in or out, but he doesn't support the Malaysian deal, that's for sure, and all the indications are that he won't agree to the change in the Migration Act. Andrew Wilkie, where do you stand on this? Do you think the Act should be changed after the High Court ruling a few weeks ago to allow offshore processing?
I don't agree with any offshore processing, whether it be Timor, Malaysia, Manus Island, Nauru or anywhere else. I believe very strongly, and I think I know a lot of Australians feel very strongly, that we should act ethically and observe our obligations as a signatory to the Refugee Convention. We should not have the excision of offshore islands. We should not have offshore processing.
Because the argument is that
we shouldn't have mandatory detention, I would add.
Well, just on the offshore processing, though, the argument is that that's the only way you can deter boats from coming. It's a dangerous journey. We all know what happened at Christmas with the boat crashing into Christmas Island. The only way you're going to stop people taking that risk is having a deterrent like Malaysia.
Look, that is the view of people who see this as a border security problem, where we basically put most of our resources on and around our border and in neighbouring countries and treat it as a security problem. And that's where this government And this opposition...
But it's a humanity issue as well, though, isn't it? It's about...
No, that's my point, David. Many of the policymakers around this place see it as a border security problem and a political problem, when in fact it is first and foremost a humanitarian problem, and it's a very complicated humanitarian problem, obviously, and we should have a very sophisticated policy that dovetails into that complexity. You know, we need to focus on the situation in source countries. We need to give much greater assistance to countries of first asylum, like Iran and Pakistan, who are, at the end of the day, going under with enormous numbers of refugees.
But can we trust Iran and, to a lesser extent, Pakistan to do the things, like, we're pumping money into Iran, a good idea?
In this case, it would be. There are safeguards. We can be involved on the ground, but not just countries of first asylum. But what the point I'm getting at here, it's the solution needs to deal with source countries, the situation in countries of first asylum, the situation in countries, transit countries, to the degree that it is a border security consideration, some resources on our border. It needs a very sophisticated policy for a very complicated problem. And all the time we should see this first and foremost as a humanitarian problem, and our obligation is always to act ethically and to abide by the Refugee Convention. So if someone makes it to our shore, by air or by boat, we are ethically and in law bound to give them protection, hear their claims, and give them refuge if their claims are found to be accurate. And if they're not, well founded, put them on the first plane back from where they came.
Tony Windsor, what do you think of this offshore processing argument?
Well, I have a different view to Andrew. I think the regional processing centre is an idea that should be looked at. I believe in the humanitarianism of it as well, but to have people taking these very high risks to get here, and many people have died attempting that, I think you've got to do something about the business model. And I agree with Andrew, there is a degree of politics where there's some focus directly on that. But a regional processing centre would still mean that Australia has an intake of refugees, and in fact I'd argue that we up the intake rather than keep it at the level we're at now, to demonstrate that we really do care.
And is Malaysia any better than Nauru then?
Well, I don't know. But I think the extension of the policy, if you have people on shore, you still encourage the boat to come, the people to take the risk, and then the people in the queue are left behind. So I'd argue that we should take more, but take them from the regional processing centre, and anybody who does risk their lives, they're actually taken to that centre rather than brought on shore.
Rob, Oakeshott?
Oh, look, I want to put a face on the whole issue. I think it is a faceless area of policy, and as a consequence, just the ugliness of two major parties going to war over this for a decade has frustrated, in my view, a lot of Australians, and common sense for the long term. The faces of criminals, to start with. If this is essentially, the whole stopping the boat exercise, if that's what we're doing, let's catch some criminals. Let's get our AFP, our ASIO, AUSTRAC, whoever we need, our relationships with Indonesia and other countries, let's catch some people and actually, metaphorically hold up some scalps who are trading no differently to guns, drugs, arguably, use the terrorist network that's been built as in crime agencies to do some good work. Secondly, community-based detention. It is alive in Australia, and it is delivering, and it is a really good success story that neither Labor or the Liberals want to talk about. Let's put some faces on that. And then thirdly, the UNHCR. I think, I'm normally a huge advocate of the UN and UNHCR and the role they play, but I get the sense there's a bit of ducks and drakes going on with their role and making it really difficult for any immigration minister to make some calls that fit in with their guidelines. So let's put a face on that, on the UNHCR. Who's making the calls? What exactly are you telling us as a country to do? And let's start to, put some faces on this policy area so we own it a bit more than I think what we currently do.
We've only got a minute left. I want to finish where we began. Is the Parliament going to run, just quickly, the full term? Will we get to 2013 with this Parliament?
Hung Parliament's fragile by nature. There can be deaths, and Andrew, with his poker machines, anything can happen. My guess is it probably will.
I'm doing my push-ups, I hope everyone else is as well.
Andrew?
I think my best guess is it's going to go 3 years. Julia Gillard's going to stay the Prime Minister, and we're going to have a really tight election.
You said you'll contest the next election in Denison. Tony Windsor, will you go round again in New England?
I intend to, yes.
And Rob?
Yeah.
On that note, we thank you all for joining us and wish you well for the next 2 years, if it does last that long. Tony Windsor, Rob Oakeshott, Andrew Wilkie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks for your company. We'll be back same time next week. See you then.